The airport terminal was packed that Tuesday afternoon. Flight 447 to New York had already been delayed twice, and passengers were getting restless. Some paced near the windows, phones pressed to their ears as they rescheduled meetings. Others slumped in the uncomfortable chairs, resigned to the wait. Among them sat a man in his late 30s dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His leather briefcase sat beside him, monogrammed with his initials. He'd been checking his watch every few minutes for the past hour, his jaw clenched tighter each time. This delay was destroying his schedule. He had a presentation in Manhattan that evening, one that could make or break a deal worth millions. Every minute stuck in Los Angeles was a minute closer to disaster. When the gate agent finally announced boarding, there was an audible sigh of relief from the crowd. The businessman was among the first to stand, straightening his tie and grabbing his carry-on. He'd paid extra for business class specifically to avoid the chaos of economy, and he intended to make the most of it. As he walked down the jetway, he was already thinking about the flight. He'd use the extra space to review his presentation one more time, maybe have a decent meal, definitely a drink to take the edge off. Business class was supposed to be a refuge from the stress of travel, a place where professionals like him could work in peace. But when he stepped into the cabin, something immediately annoyed him. There, in one of the window seats, was a man who looked completely out of place. The guy was wearing faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a weathered motorcycle jacket that had seen better days. A baseball cap was pulled low over his face, and he was absorbed in a paperback book, the kind you'd pick up at a drugstore. The businessman felt his irritation spike. This was exactly what he was talking about when he complained about airlines these days. Standards had really dropped. Anyone could apparently wander into business class now. The man looked like he'd just walked off a construction site, not like someone who belonged in the premium cabin. He shoved his bag into the overhead compartment with more force than necessary, stealing glances at the inappropriately dressed passenger. The guy hadn't even looked up from his book. He sat there completely relaxed, one leg crossed over the other, as if he had every right to be there. It was infuriating. More passengers filed in behind him. A woman in a business suit took the aisle seat across from the casually dressed man. She glanced at him briefly, did a slight double-take, then quickly looked away with what might have been recognition in her eyes. But she said nothing and settled into her seat. The businessman found his own seat a few rows back, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe the guy had used points to upgrade. Or worse, maybe he'd just walked into business class hoping no one would notice. It happened sometimes. People got bold, especially on full flights where flight attendants were too busy to check every boarding pass. He tried to focus on pulling up his presentation on his laptop, but his eyes kept drifting forward to that motorcycle jacket. It was such a small thing, he knew that logically. But today, everything felt like it was falling apart, and this felt like one more example of how nothing worked the way it was supposed to anymore. His morning had started badly. Coffee spilled on his first shirt choice. Traffic on the 405 had been a nightmare. Then the flight delays, the endless waiting, the knowledge that his carefully planned schedule was crumbling, and now this. Someone who couldn't even be bothered to dress appropriately for business class, taking up space that should go to real professionals. A flight attendant made her way down the aisle, checking that bags were properly stowed. The businessman saw his chance. He flagged her down, keeping his voice low but firm. "Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice," he said, gesturing subtly toward the front. "That passenger up there, the one in the casual attire, is he actually supposed to be in this cabin?" The flight attendant followed his gaze, and he could have sworn he saw the briefest flicker of something in her expression. Amusement? Disbelief? It vanished quickly. "All passengers in this cabin have valid boarding passes, sir," she said politely. "Is there something else I can help you with?" He felt dismissed. The attendant moved on before he could respond, continuing her safety checks. Around him, other passengers were settling in. A teenage girl in the row across was looking at her phone, occasionally glancing forward with barely contained excitement. She kept trying to get a better look at something or someone in the front rows. The businessman couldn't let it go. It was the principle of the thing. Business class meant something. It was supposed to be a cut above, a place where appearance and professionalism mattered. If airlines were just going to let anyone in regardless of how they presented themselves, what was the point of the extra cost? He stood up, smoothing down his suit jacket. Several passengers were still trying to find overhead bin space, creating a small crowd in the aisle. He waited impatiently, tapping his foot. The man in the motorcycle jacket still hadn't moved, still hadn't even looked up from his book. The baseball cap obscured most of his face from this angle. That casual indifference bothered him more than anything. Here everyone else was, dressed professionally, respecting the environment they were in, and this guy couldn't care less. He probably thought the rules didn't apply to him. Probably thought he was too cool to make an effort. The aisle finally cleared enough for him to move forward. His heart was beating faster than usual. He wasn't normally one for confrontation, but today something in him had snapped. Too many small frustrations had piled up, and this felt like the one thing he could actually control. The one place where he could restore some sense of order to his chaotic day. As he approached, he noticed the woman sitting across from the casually dressed passenger was watching him. Her expression was hard to read, something between concern and anticipation. The teenage girl had put down her phone and was staring openly now. The man in the baseball cap turned a page in his book, still completely unaware of the approaching confrontation. His jacket sleeve had ridden up slightly, revealing a simple watch, nothing flashy. His whole appearance screamed someone who either didn't know better or didn't care about social expectations. The businessman stopped beside the seat, standing tall in his expensive suit. This was his moment to stand up for standards, for the way things should be. Someone had to say something. Someone had to maintain some level of decorum in a world that seemed increasingly willing to abandon it. He cleared his throat, loud enough to be heard over the ambient noise of boarding. A few heads turned in their direction. The flight attendants were busy at the front of the plane, going through their pre-flight preparations. The man in the baseball cap still hadn't looked up. He seemed lost in whatever he was reading, one hand resting on the armrest, completely at ease in his window seat. That relaxation, that comfort in a place where he so obviously didn't fit in, made the businessman even more certain he was doing the right thing. This was about more than just one inappropriately dressed passenger. This was about maintaining the social contract, about respecting the spaces we occupy, about understanding that some places require a certain standard of presentation. If he didn't say something, who would? He took a breath, feeling the weight of his own stress and frustration crystallizing into this single moment of action. The words came out louder than he'd intended. "Excuse me, I think you need to move back to economy." The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The sound of bags being shuffled overhead ceased. Even the crying baby 3 rows back seemed to pause for breath. The man in the baseball cap slowly looked up from his book, but the businessman was too caught up in his own momentum to really see his face yet. The cap's brim still cast a shadow, and honestly, he was too focused on making his point to care who this person actually was. "This is business class," he continued, his voice carrying through the now quiet cabin. "I don't know how you got in here, but you clearly don't belong. Your seat is back there." He gestured toward the curtain separating business from economy, his hand sweeping in a dismissive arc. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. The woman across the aisle had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. The teenage girl looked like she wanted to crawl under her seat from secondhand embarrassment. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," the businessman went on, feeling more confident now that he'd started. "Maybe you got confused at boarding, or maybe you thought you could just slip in here and no one would notice. But this section is for paying customers who understand appropriate standards." The man in the cap still hadn't said anything. He'd placed a finger on the page he was reading, marking his place, and was looking up with an expression that was hard to read. Patient, maybe, or tired. Definitely not angry, which somehow made the businessman feel like he needed to press harder. "Look, I'm not trying to be rude," he said, though the entire cabin could tell that ship had sailed. "But people pay good money for these seats. We expect a certain environment, a certain level of," he paused, searching for the word, "professionalism, and you're dressed like you're going to work on someone's car." A businessman 2 rows forward actually closed his eyes and shook his head slowly. Another passenger had pulled out their phone, not to record exactly, but holding it like they might need to at any moment. The flight attendant who'd dismissed his earlier concern came rushing over, her professional smile strained. "Sir, is there a problem here?" "Yes, there is," he said, feeling vindicated by her arrival. "This passenger is inappropriately dressed for business class, and I believe he may be in the wrong seat. Could you please check his boarding pass?" The flight attendant glanced at the man in the cap, and that same flicker of expression crossed her face again. This time he could identify it more clearly. She was trying not to smile, or maybe trying not to laugh. Why would she be amused? "Sir," she said to the businessman, her voice carefully controlled, "I can assure you that every passenger in this cabin is seated correctly and has a valid ticket. Perhaps you should return to your own seat so we can complete boarding." "But look at him," the businessman protested, his voice rising slightly. "He's wearing a motorcycle jacket. And those boots. He looks like he just came from a biker bar, not a business flight to New York." The man in the cap finally spoke. His voice was quiet, calm, with a quality that made people lean in to listen rather than requiring volume to be heard. "I appreciate your concern about the seating arrangements," he said gently, "but I'm actually in my assigned seat. There's no mistake." "Let me see your boarding pass then," the businessman demanded, his face flushing. He was in too deep now to back down. Everyone was watching, and he needed to be proven right. The man reached into his jacket pocket with unhurried movements and pulled out his boarding pass. He held it up without a word. The flight attendant leaned in to look, then nodded at the businessman. "Row 4, seat A," she confirmed, "exactly where he's sitting." The businessman felt his certainty waver for the first time. But he'd come this far. Well, just because he has a ticket doesn't mean he's appropriate for this cabin. There are dress codes for a reason, standards. This is business class, not some dive bar. "Sir," the flight attendant's voice had lost its patient edge, "there is no dress code for passengers in any cabin. Now please return to your seat immediately or I'll have to ask you to deplane." Around them, more passengers were paying attention now. Some looked sympathetic to the businessman, though most seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the scene. A man in a polo shirt was whispering to his wife, and they both kept glancing between the businessman and the man in the cap with expressions of disbelief. "This is ridiculous," the businessman said, but his voice had lost its conviction. "I'm just trying to maintain some standards here. Is that really so wrong? We're not asking for much, just that people dress appropriately for the cabin they're in. Is that such a crazy expectation?" The teenage girl couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Dude," she said, her voice cracking slightly, "you really need to stop." He turned to her, annoyed. "This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it kind of does concern everyone," she shot back, her cheeks red but her voice determined. "You're making a scene and embarrassing yourself." "I'm embarrassing myself?" He laughed without humor. "I'm not the one dressed like I'm going to a garage sale." The woman across the aisle finally spoke up, her voice sharp. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" "I don't care if he's the King of England," the businessman snapped. "That jacket has got to be 20 years old, and those jeans look like they've seen better days. This is business class, business, as in professional environment, as in people who respect themselves and others enough to dress appropriately." The man in the cap had been sitting quietly through all of this, his finger still marking his place in his book. Now he carefully placed a bookmark and closed the book, setting it on his lap. He pushed the baseball cap back slightly, and for the first time the businessman got a clear look at his face. The recognition didn't come immediately. It started as a vague sense of familiarity, like seeing someone you went to high school with at the grocery store but not quite placing them. Then it hit him in waves. First, the realization that this face was famous. Second, the understanding of exactly who he was looking at. Third, the crushing awareness of what he'd just done. It was Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves, John Wick, Neo from The Matrix. That guy who was always in the news for giving up his subway seat to strangers. The actor famous not just for movies but for being one of the genuinely nicest people in Hollywood. The businessman's face went from flushed red to pale white in a matter of seconds. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Around him he could hear the whispers starting. "Oh my God, I knew it was him. Is that really him? Did that guy seriously just tell Keanu Reeves to move to economy? This is going to be all over social media in about 5 minutes." The flight attendant had her hand over her face now, trying to maintain professionalism, but clearly struggling. Other crew members had gathered at the front of business class, watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from shock to barely suppressed amusement. Keanu Reeves looked up at the businessman with those same calm, kind eyes that had made him famous not just for his acting, but for his humanity. There was no anger there, no indignation, just patience and a slight sadness, like he was disappointed but not surprised. "Listen," Keanu said softly, I understand you're having a tough day. We all have them, but I'm just trying to get to New York, same as you. My seat's paid for, I'm not bothering anyone, and I'd really like to get back to my book if that's okay. The businessman stood frozen. His expensive suit suddenly felt too tight. The cabin felt too hot. Every eye in business class was on him, and most of those eyes were not friendly. The teenage girl was recording on her phone now, not even trying to hide it. The woman across the aisle was shaking her head in disgust. I didn't realize, he stammered. That's the problem, isn't it? The woman across the aisle said coldly. You didn't realize. You just assumed. You saw someone dressed casually and decided they didn't belong here. Did it ever occur to you that maybe clothes don't define a person's worth? The businessman wanted to explain. To say that it wasn't about Keanu specifically, that he would have said the same thing to anyone dressed that way. But even as he thought it, he realized that explanation didn't make things better. It made them worse. The flight attendant touched the businessman's elbow gently but firmly. Sir, you need to return to your seat now. We're about to close the cabin doors. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over someone's bag in the aisle. His legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. The walk back to his seat, just a few rows away, felt like a mile. Every pair of eyes tracked his movement. Some passengers whispered behind their hands. Others just stared openly, their expressions ranging from pity to outright contempt. When he finally collapsed into his seat, his hands were shaking. He fumbled with his seatbelt, missing the buckle twice before getting it fastened. His laptop sat on the tray table in front of him, his presentation still open on the screen. But the numbers and charts might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made to him now. Behind him, he could hear two men talking in low voices. Can you believe that guy? Telling Keanu Reeves he doesn't belong in business class? The Keanu Reeves. The guy who literally gave away most of his Matrix money to the crew, who takes the subway and gives up his seat to random people. That Keanu Reeves. Man dressed like he's comfortable, not trying to impress anyone, and that dude loses his mind over it. The businessman wanted to sink through the floor. He wanted the plane to hit turbulence so extreme they'd have to turn back. He wanted anything other than sitting here trapped in this seat, with everyone knowing what he'd just done. The flight attendants went through their safety demonstration, but he couldn't focus on it. His mind kept replaying the confrontation, each repetition making him feel worse. The way he'd gestured dismissively toward economy, the condescending tone when he'd said dive bar, the assumption that someone's clothing determined their right to be somewhere, and of all the people to target with his judgment and frustration, it had been Keanu Reeves. The man was literally famous for being humble. There were countless stories online of his kindness to fans, to service workers, to random strangers. He'd taken pay cuts on films to make sure other actors could be hired. He'd bought motorcycles for his stunt team. He'd set up a private cancer foundation without putting his name on it. The businessman had seen those stories. He'd probably even liked some of them on social media, thinking, what a good guy, before scrolling on to the next thing. And now here he was, having become the villain in what would probably be one of those viral stories by tomorrow morning. The plane began to taxi, and he glanced toward the front of the cabin. Keanu had his book open again, seemingly unbothered by what had just happened. He looked perfectly content in his window seat, with his old jacket and his worn boots and his drugstore paperback. The woman across from him had struck up a conversation, and he was responding with a warm smile, completely engaged despite the scene that had just unfolded. That made it worse somehow. If Keanu had gotten angry, if he'd snapped back or demanded an apology, the businessman might have felt justified in thinking, see, everyone gets upset when challenged. But no, the man had responded with grace and understanding, exactly as all those internet stories said he would, which meant the businessman was entirely, completely, inexcusably in the wrong. The teenage girl who'd told him off earlier was texting furiously, her thumbs flying over her phone screen. He didn't need to see her screen to know what she was writing. OMG, you guys won't believe what just happened on my flight. By the time they landed in New York, this would probably be trending somewhere. A businessman across the aisle leaned over. For a second, the man in the expensive suit hoped for some solidarity, someone who might understand where he was coming from. That was really something, the other businessman said quietly. I didn't know who he was. He replied defensively. Does that matter? The question hung in the air. You would have been just as rude to him if he was a mechanic or a teacher, or anyone else who happened to be wearing jeans on a plane. Maybe worse, because then there'd be no consequences. The businessman opened his mouth to argue but found he had no response, because it was true. If that had been some random working-class person in that seat, he would have felt completely justified in his comments. He might have even felt heroic about it, standing up for standards and all that. But it was only now, when he realized he'd insulted someone famous and beloved, that he felt ashamed. What did that say about him? The plane lifted off, pressing him back into his seat. Usually he loved this moment. The surge of power as the aircraft defied gravity and climbed into the sky. Today it just felt like pressure, like the weight of his own behavior holding him down. His phone was in airplane mode, but his mind raced through all the ways this could go viral. Someone had definitely been recording. That teenage girl for sure, probably others too. By tonight, there could be videos circulating with titles like, "Entitled Business Guy Gets Shut Down by Keanu Reeves," or "Man Tells Movie Star to Move to Economy. Immediately regrets it." His company had a social media policy. His boss was active on Twitter. His colleagues would see this. His clients might see this. That crucial presentation tonight suddenly seemed less important than damage control. How do you come back from becoming an internet meme for being an elitist jerk? The flight attendant came by with drinks. "Something to drink, sir?" "Whiskey," he said. "Double." She nodded without comment and moved on. When she returned with the drink, he noticed her expression was carefully neutral, professionally blank. But he caught her glancing toward the front of the cabin, toward Keanu, with something that looked like respect and maybe even admiration. He sipped the whiskey, feeling it burn down his throat. Normally, he'd savor a drink like this, enjoying the warmth and the slight buzz. Today, it just tasted bitter, like everything else. Around him, the cabin had settled into the familiar rhythms of a flight. People were reading, working on laptops, watching movies on their seatback screens. But every so often, someone would glance toward row 4, where Keanu sat reading his book. And then they'd glance back at him, the man who'd made a fool of himself. A few rows up, he heard someone laugh and his whole body tensed. Were they laughing at him? Probably. Why wouldn't they be? He'd provided the entertainment for this flight. The story people would tell their friends and family when they landed. "You won't believe what happened on my flight to New York. Some guy in a suit totally went off on this other passenger about his clothes. And it turned out to be Keanu Reeves." "No way." "Yes." And the guy in the suit was so embarrassed I thought he might actually cry. He wasn't going to cry, but his eyes did sting a bit. From the altitude, probably. Definitely from the altitude. The businessman tried to focus on his presentation, but the words swam on the screen. He kept thinking about what he'd said, about professionalism, about standards, about appropriate dress codes. All those words he'd used to justify his judgment, his need to feel superior to someone else. The truth he was beginning to confront was ugly. He hadn't been standing up for standards. He'd been taking out his frustration on someone he perceived as an acceptable target, someone he thought was beneath him, someone who wouldn't push back or cause problems. He'd been a bully. There was really no other word for it. A well-dressed, educated, successful bully who'd picked on someone for the crime of wearing comfortable clothes on an airplane. And the universe had responded by making sure his victim was literally one of the nicest, most humble famous people on the planet, someone whose whole public persona was built on treating everyone with respect, regardless of who they were or what they did. Someone who regularly went out of his way to be kind to strangers. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't happening to him. He finished his whiskey and considered ordering another, but decided against it. Getting drunk wouldn't help. Nothing would help except maybe learning to be less of a jerk, though he wasn't sure how to start that process at 38 years old. His phone buzzed with a notification, and he remembered he was supposed to text his assistant when they took off. He pulled it out and saw he had service through the plane's Wi-Fi. Against his better judgment, he opened Twitter. He didn't have to search far. It was already there, third trending topic, Keanu on a plane. His stomach dropped. With trembling fingers, he clicked on the hashtag. The tweets loaded and his worst fears were confirmed. The teenage girl had already posted and her tweet had thousands of retweets. Just watched a businessman tell someone in jeans to go to economy. It was Keanu Reeves. "I'm deceased." This man really said, "You look like you work in a garage," to John Wick. Below that were videos. Multiple angles, multiple phones, all capturing different moments of his spectacular public humiliation. In one, you could clearly see his face as he gestured dismissively toward the back of the plane. In another, the moment of recognition when he realized who he was talking to. His face going white, his mouth hanging open, the comments were brutal. Imagine being this entitled. This is what privilege looks like, folks. Keanu was so gracious about it too. This dude doesn't deserve that kindness. How do you look at someone and decide they don't belong somewhere based on their clothes? Gross. This is business class, sir. This is a Wendy's. That last one had 50,000 likes. He closed the app and put his phone face down on the tray table. His hands were shaking again. This wasn't just embarrassing. This was career-threatening. His firm represented high-net-worth clients who cared deeply about reputation and image. How would they feel about being represented by someone viral for being an elitist jerk? The rest of the flight passed in a blur of anxiety. He couldn't eat the meal they served, though he noticed the flight attendants seemed extra attentive to Keanu, bringing him things without being asked, smiling warmly. They were polite to him too, professionally so, but there was a coolness there that hadn't been present before boarding. Every time someone walked down the aisle to use the restroom, he tensed, wondering if they'd say something. A few people did glance at him as they passed, and one older woman shook her head disapprovingly, but most just ignored him, which somehow felt worse than confrontation would have. He spent the flight alternating between reviewing his presentation, which still needed to be perfect, and spiraling into shame and anxiety. The juxtaposition was absurd. In a few hours, he'd be standing in front of serious investors, talking about market projections and growth strategies, pretending to be a competent professional. Meanwhile, thousands of people online were watching him have a meltdown over someone's jacket. At one point, he pulled up his presentation and tried to practice his opening remarks in his head. Good evening, I'm here to discuss our Q4 projections and what? And by the way, you might have seen me trending on Twitter for being an absolute fool. The businessman, 2 rows up, the one who'd asked if it mattered whether he'd known Keanu's identity, got up to use the restroom. On his way back, he stopped briefly by the seat. Hey, he said quietly. For what it's worth, I think most of us have had moments where we're not our best selves. The difference is whether we learn from them. It was more kindness than he deserved, and somehow that made him feel worse. He mumbled a thank you, and the man returned to his seat. As they began their descent into New York, the pilot came on the intercom with the standard announcements. The businessman mechanically followed instructions, raising his tray table, putting his seat upright, making sure his seatbelt was fastened. Through the window, he could see the lights of the city emerging from the twilight. Millions of people going about their lives completely unaware that in a few hours, a decent percentage of them might know his face from social media. The wheels touched down with a slight bump and the plane taxied to the gate. Usually this was when he'd start gathering his things, eager to get off and get moving. Today he sat frozen, dreading what came next. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, everyone stood in the familiar choreographed chaos of deplaning. The businessman waited, letting others go ahead. He wasn't in a rush. He needed a few more minutes to figure out what to do, what to say, how to salvage anything from this disaster. As passengers filed past, many took the opportunity to stop and talk to Keanu, who responded to each person with genuine warmth. A little boy asked for a photo, and Keanu crouched down to his level, making conversation about the kid's favorite movie. A woman thanked him for being kind even when people were rude to him, and he just smiled and said everyone has difficult days. The businessman watched all of this from his seat, a few rows back. This was who Keanu Reeves was. Not the famous actor, not the action hero, but a person who treated everyone like they mattered, who didn't judge people by their appearance or their station in life, who showed grace under circumstances where most people would have been justified in anger. The contrast with his own behavior was stark and painful. Finally, the aisle cleared enough for him to stand. His legs felt stiff from tension more than from sitting. He grabbed his carry-on from the overhead bin, the expensive leather bag that had seemed so important this morning when he was packing. As he stepped into the aisle, he saw that Keanu was still in his seat, letting the crowd thin out before getting up. The flight attendants were chatting with him, clearly in no rush to move him along. One was laughing at something he'd said. The businessman knew he should just walk past. Get off the plane. go to his hotel, prepare for his presentation, try to pretend the last few hours hadn't happened. That would be the easy thing, but for the first time all day he didn't want to take the easy thing. He wanted to do the right thing, even though it terrified him more than any business presentation ever had. He stopped beside row 4. Keanu looked up from his conversation with the flight attendant, his expression neutral, waiting. "I owe you an apology," the businessman said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "A real one. Not because you're famous, but because what I did was inexcusable regardless of who you are." Keanu studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." "I was having a terrible day," the businessman continued, then caught himself. "But that's not an excuse. That's not even a reason. I saw someone dressed differently than I expected, and I decided they didn't belong somewhere. That's not about bad days. That's about bad judgment and worse character." The flight attendants had quietly stepped back, giving them space. The few remaining passengers slowed their exit, some openly watching, others pretending not to listen. "I spent this whole flight thinking about what I did," he said. "And I realized the worst part isn't that I didn't recognize you. It's that I would have been even more comfortable saying those things if you hadn't been famous, because then there'd be no consequences. No videos, no accountability. Just some random person I made feel small because I was having a bad day and needed to feel big." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He cleared his throat. "That's who I was today. Someone who judges people by their clothes and decides their worth, based on whether they meet some arbitrary standard I've set. And I'm ashamed of that person. I'm ashamed it took viral humiliation to make me see it." Keanu was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the plane had gone silent. Even the flight attendants were still, watching this unfold. "You know what I think?" Keanu finally said, his voice gentle. "I think you're being harder on yourself right now than you needed to be hard on me earlier. Not that you shouldn't reflect on it. You should. But beating yourself up is just another form of self-centeredness." The businessman blinked, surprised by the observation. "What matters," Keanu continued, "is what you do next. Do you go back to judging people by their appearance tomorrow? Or do you remember this feeling and let it change how you see people?" "I want to change," the businessman said. "I need to change." "Then change," Keanu said simply. "Not because it went viral. Not because it happened to be me. But because treating people with respect is the right thing to do. Every time. Everyone." They talked for another few minutes there in the empty plane while the cleaning crew waited patiently outside. Keanu shared a story about a time early in his career when someone had judged him for showing up to an audition on his motorcycle, dressed in riding gear. The casting director had almost turned him away, assuming he wasn't serious about acting because of how he looked. "The difference," Keanu said, "is that guy never apologized. Never thought about it again, probably. You're already doing better than that." The businessman wasn't sure he agreed, but he appreciated the kindness in the statement. They exchanged a few more words, nothing profound, just two people talking like humans. When they finally left the plane, the flight attendants smiled at both of them, though the warmth in their smiles was distinctly different. In the jetway, the businessman started to head toward the exit, but Keanu called after him. "Hey, what's your presentation about tonight?" The question caught him off guard. "Market analysis for renewable energy investments." "That's important work," Keanu said. "Good luck with it." And then he was gone, disappearing into the terminal with the same casual, unhurried gait he'd had on the plane. Just another traveler heading to his destination, wearing his comfortable jacket and his worn boots, not caring what anyone thought about it. The businessman made his way to baggage claim in a daze. His phone was blowing up with messages. His assistant had texted 3 times asking if he was okay. His boss had sent a terse message. "We need to talk about your social media situation." His presentation was in 2 hours. He should go to his hotel, review his notes, prepare. But instead he found himself standing by the baggage carousel, watching bags circle endlessly, thinking about everything that had happened. A woman standing next to him was on her phone. "Did you see that video of the guy on the plane?" She was saying to whoever was on the other end. "With Keanu Reeves? It's wild. The guy was so mean just because the other person was dressed casually. Like, who does that?" The businessman grabbed his bag when it came around and quickly left before she could notice him. Outside, the New York evening was cool and busy with the sounds of traffic and distant sirens. He hailed a cab and gave the driver his hotel address. As they drove through the city, His phone continued its steady stream of notifications. The video had spread beyond Twitter now. It was on Instagram, TikTok, even LinkedIn, where one of his colleagues had shared it with the caption, "Reminder that professionalism is about how you treat people, not what you wear." That one stung particularly hard because it was from someone at his firm. By tomorrow, everyone in his office would know. The managing partners would have questions. His reputation, carefully built over years of hard work, was now tied to a 30-second video of him being terrible to a stranger. At the hotel, he checked in and went straight to his room. The space was nice, expensive, the kind of place business travelers stayed when they wanted to feel successful. He dropped his bag and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his reflection in the mirror across the room. Who was that person looking back? A man in an expensive suit who'd learned today that clothes really didn't make the man. That all his professional success, his designer labels, his business class tickets meant nothing if he used them as weapons to make others feel less than. His phone rang. His boss. He considered not answering, but that would only make things worse. "We've seen the videos," his boss said without preamble. "The firm is getting calls from some clients who saw them. They're concerned about whether this reflects our values." "It doesn't," the businessman said quickly. "Or it shouldn't. I made a mistake. A huge one. But I'm going to fix it." "How exactly do you plan to fix a viral video?" "I don't know yet. But I'm going to figure it out." There was a long pause. "Don't screw up this presentation tonight. We need this deal. Whatever personal issues you're working through, put them aside for the next few hours and do your job." The call ended. The businessman sat there holding his phone, feeling the weight of expectations. Just put it aside. Do the job. Compartmentalize, that was the professional thing to do, right? He pulled up his presentation on his laptop and tried to review it. But Keanu's words kept echoing in his head. What matters is what you do next. What did he do next? Give a great presentation, save the deal, hope the video eventually faded from public memory? That seemed like the smart play. The survivable play. Keep his head down. Do good work. Let time heal the damage to his reputation. But would that be change? Or would that just be damage control? An hour before his presentation, he made a decision. He opened his laptop and started writing. Not notes for his presentation, but something else entirely. A statement. An actual, genuine acknowledgement of what had happened and what he'd learned. He wrote about privilege and assumptions. About how easy it is to judge others when you've never had to think about being judged yourself. About the ways success can insulate you from understanding how your actions affect people with less power, less status, less protection from casual cruelty. It wasn't eloquent. It probably wasn't even good. But it was honest, and that felt important. He posted it to his LinkedIn with a link to one of the videos and the simple caption, "This is me learning a very public lesson about respect, judgment, and humility." Then he closed his laptop, gathered his materials, and headed to his presentation. The investors were already seated when he arrived. They looked at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. One of them was scrolling through his phone when the businessman entered, and he could have sworn he saw the video playing on the screen before the man quickly locked it. "Gentlemen," the businessman began, "before we discuss renewable energy markets, I need to address something. You've probably seen a video that's been circulating today, the one from the plane." The investors shifted uncomfortably. This clearly wasn't what they'd expected. "That was me at my worst," he continued, "making judgments about someone based on appearance, using my discomfort and stress as an excuse to make someone else feel unwelcome. It was wrong, and I've apologized to the person involved. But I'm bringing it up now because I believe how we conduct ourselves as individuals reflects on how we conduct business." He paused, gauging their reactions. One investor was leaning forward, interested. Another looked skeptical. The third was unreadable. "The renewable energy sector is about changing old patterns that don't serve us anymore," he said. "About recognizing that just because we've always done something one way doesn't mean it's the right way. That's not just true for energy policy. It's true for how we treat people. And if I can't demonstrate that kind of growth and self-awareness in my personal conduct, how can I advise you on navigating industry transformation?" It was a risk, a huge one. But it felt right in a way that just pretending nothing had happened wouldn't have. The presentation went surprisingly well after that. The investors asked tough questions, but they seemed to respect his candor. One of them even shared a story about his own moment of reckoning with unconscious bias. By the end, while they didn't commit to anything immediately, they scheduled a follow-up meeting for the next month. Walking back to his hotel that night, the businessman felt different. Not absolved. He'd done something wrong, and no amount of good presentations would erase that. But he felt like maybe, possibly, he was starting to understand something important about himself and the world. Over the next few weeks, the video gradually faded from trending status, replaced by newer outrage and entertainment. But the businessman didn't forget. He couldn't and he didn't want to. He started noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. Like the way people in his office building treated the security guards differently than they treated the executives. The assumptions people made about competence based on age, appearance, or accent. The subtle ways privilege manifested in who got listened to in meetings and whose ideas got credited. He began calling it out, gently at first, then more directly. In a team meeting, when someone dismissed an assistant's suggestion without really listening, he made sure to circle back to it. When a colleague made a comment about a client's unprofessional attire, he pushed back. It made him unpopular in some circles, but he found he cared less about that than he'd expected. His assistant noticed the change. "You're different lately," she said one day while they were reviewing his schedule. "Better different or worse different?" She considered the question. "More human different. Like you're actually thinking about how things feel for other people, instead of just moving through your day." It wasn't a bad epitaph for his old self, he thought. 3 months after the incident, he was on another flight to the West Coast. This time he was in economy, not because he couldn't afford business class, but because he'd given his upgrade certificate to a colleague who was recovering from back surgery and needed the extra space. Halfway through the flight, he noticed a situation developing a few rows ahead. A man in a business suit was getting increasingly agitated with the passenger next to him. A young woman in casual clothes who was taking up slightly more than her share of the armrest. The businessman watched as the man's complaints grew louder. "This is why they should have dress codes," the man was saying. "People who can't afford to fly comfortably should take the bus." Before he could think too hard about it, the businessman unbuckled his seatbelt and moved forward. "Excuse me," he said to the complaining passenger. "I don't think there's any need for that kind of talk." The man looked up, annoyed. "This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does. We're all stuck in this metal tube together for the next few hours. Making someone feel bad about themselves doesn't make your flight any better." The young woman looked at him with surprise and gratitude. The complaining man sputtered for a moment, then fell silent, clearly not expecting to be challenged. As the businessman returned to his seat, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, and definitely not self-satisfaction. Maybe just the quiet knowledge that he'd done the right thing, even when it was uncomfortable. His phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from one of the investors he'd met with that night in New York, the one after the incident. They were ready to move forward with the deal. In the email, the investor mentioned that their board had been impressed not just with the analysis, but with the integrity shown in addressing the difficult situation head-on. "We believe people and organizations capable of genuine self-reflection are the ones who can navigate the changes ahead." The email read. The businessman smiled and put his phone away. Outside the window, clouds stretched endlessly, white and perfect against the blue sky. Somewhere up here in another plane on another day, Keanu Reeves was probably reading a book in comfortable clothes, treating flight attendants with kindness, and being exactly who he was without apology. The businessman hoped he was learning to do the same. Not to be like Keanu Reeves exactly, but to be someone who judged people by their character instead of their appearance. Someone who used whatever privilege and platform he had to make spaces more welcoming, not more exclusive. Someone who remembered that everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about, and kindness costs nothing. It was a simple lesson, really. One most people learn as children, but sometimes it takes a viral video, a famous actor in a motorcycle jacket, and the crushing weight of public humiliation to remember what should have been obvious all along. Everyone belongs everywhere, not because of what they wear or how much money they have or whether they fit some arbitrary standard of appropriateness, but because they're human beings deserving of basic respect and dignity. As the plane began its descent, The businessman thought about that moment on the tarmac at LAX, standing in front of Keanu's seat so certain of his righteousness. So convinced he was standing up for standards when really he'd just been standing on someone else to make himself feel taller. He'd never make that mistake again, and if he saw someone else making it, he'd speak up, not to shame them the way he'd been shamed, but to maybe help them learn the lesson a little less publicly, a little less painfully. Because that was the real lesson, wasn't it? Not that judgment was wrong only when directed at famous people, but that it was wrong, period. That clothes didn't determine worth, that everyone deserved to exist in spaces without having to justify their presence based on appearance or assumptions. The wheels touched down with that familiar bump, and the businessman smiled to himself. He had another meeting tomorrow, another presentation to give. But tonight, he was going to find a good book and a comfortable chair in a quiet corner of his hotel, maybe wear his oldest jeans while doing it. After all, comfort wasn't something to apologize for, and anyone who thought otherwise clearly hadn't learned the lesson yet. But they would. Life had a way of teaching these things one way or another. He just hoped for their sake it would be gentler than a viral video trending worldwide, though sometimes he had to admit, the hard lessons were the ones that stuck. He grabbed his bag from the overhead compartment and joined the line of passengers shuffling toward the exit. As he stepped off the plane, he nodded thanks to the flight attendants, making sure to make eye contact to see them as people doing a difficult job well. Small things. But small things mattered. That was perhaps the biggest lesson of all. The world changed not through grand gestures, but through countless small choices to be kind, to be aware, to be better than you were yesterday. And if a man in a worn motorcycle jacket had taught him that, well, that seemed appropriate somehow. The best teachers rarely look the way you expect them to. Sometimes they're movie stars reading paperback books. Sometimes they're strangers on planes who respond to rudeness with grace. The businessman walked through the terminal toward baggage claim, just another traveler in the endless flow of humanity passing through airports every day. Anonymous again. Forgotten again. And somehow that felt exactly right.